We return now to my interview with Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad, the former U.S. negotiator with the Taliban. Secretary Blinken has said President Biden inherited this deal and not a plan to execute it.
Right.
Whose job was that?
Well, I think that they did inherit the agreement. No doubt they had an opportunity to take a look at it, and they did. They could have made a variety of decisions with regard to that agreement. They decided to stick with the withdrawal provisions of the agreement.
They claimed their hands were tied. It would have required plussing up of U.S. military presence in the country for them to do anything other than accept what you handed them.
Well,
do you buy that?
I think my judgment is they had two basic options. Go with a condition-based approach, see if the Taliban met the conditions of the agreement. If the decision could have been, if yes, we'll implement our part of that agreement, or to go for a calendar-based approach. And the decision was to go for a calendar-based approach.
Do you think American politics drove this more than the national security strategy?
Well, I mean, the question is on the national security, that we are in a different world that we were in 2001. The big issue facing us now is the rise of China, the potential bipolarity, a comprehensive competition.
Americans just watched on television this chaotic withdrawal.
Right. Well,
this didn't happen like you imagined it would happen.
Right. Well, I mean, that could be looked at as well. I mean, it wasn't good. I agree with that. Nobody says that was good the way it happened.
Why wasn't there a better plan in place from the Trump administration or crafted by the Biden administration to execute what you put on paper?
Well, this execution of the last phase was not a military withdrawal that went awry. It was the response of the Afghan people to what was happening that created the scenes at the airport. It was a combination of fear and opportunity.
The Taliban were inside the city, inside Kabul,
and people
when
thought
President Ghani fled.
Right, but we got an agreement with them on the 14th, 15th of August that the two small units that were there would withdraw, that President Ghani would send an empowered delegation. In fact, there is a report that he prepared a statement on video, his agreement that for the 2 weeks, sending a delegation, a power-sharing government. But why he didn't stay to see the implementation of that and withdrawal still is unclear.
But the Taliban's literally knocking on the doors, some inside the city of Kabul. And the United States military is still there. Why didn't the U.S. State Department have a plan to execute what you negotiated and had been in writing for years? Why wasn't that left by the Trump administration? Why wasn't that created by Tony Blinken and the State Department?
The plan for withdrawal, which is the responsibility of the Defense Department, was developed. General McKenzie came on the 15th to explain that to the Talibs in Doha. He and I sat with the Talib leaders, and the military plan was in place, and a good plan. What complicated the situation was the popular reaction in Kabul, the cause of which was both fear and opportunity. Fear because for a long time, everybody was saying, including some officials, that when the Talibs come into Kabul, there will be a terrible war, street-to-street fighting, destruction of the city. So people were afraid. That was one. Two, the impression was created that anyone who can make it to the airport, whether you have documents or not, you will be evacuated to the United States and to Europe. That combination led to this flood of people to come to the airport and caused the terrible scenes.
But are you saying everything that happened was inevitable?
No, I don't think it was inevitable. I think we could have had a negotiated settlement. We could have had the 2 weeks agreement implemented. There were choices that people made. Mistakes also, no doubt, were made. President Ghani made the choice that he did that caused his forces to disintegrate in Kabul.
To flee the country, on August the 15th.
Right.
Some of his allies would argue the military was already melting away. The Taliban
Not
was
in
already at the
Kabul.
door. He was irrelevant at that point.
Not in Kabul. Kabul is a city of 5-6 million people.
The Taliban was there.
The Taliban, as I said, they had some, maybe a few hundred forces already in, but they agreed to withdraw that, and they announced it. And they said they will take, in their discussions with us, that they would take some of the government leaders, officials, into the next government. So the question is, why did President Ghani do what he did? If he was willing to step aside for the sake of peace, imagine if he had offered that a year ago, 6 months ago, that somebody that's mutually acceptable could have led the government, but he did not.
But fundamentally, the critique of you is that while you were sitting in Doha negotiating with Taliban political leaders, their fighters were on the battlefield with no intention to follow through on what you were negotiating. Do you believe that you were misled by the Taliban leaders you negotiated with?
I believe that the agreement said that we will implement what we committed to if the Taliban implemented what they committed to.
Were you negotiating with the right people, though?
No doubt, because we tested them.
But that's not who's running Afghanistan now.
Well, they are part of it, but in part, again, President Ghani's departure created a situation in which the problem became resolved, although still we'll see what ultimately happens, by military means. And that, in turn, empowered the more militant Talibs. I believe that a negotiated withdrawal would have empowered more moderate, those who were involved in the negotiations. So there are two factors. The agreement itself was condition-based, a package.
Right. And then the Biden administration said it won't be a conditions-based withdrawal.
Well, that's a decision that was made. That was a decision made way above my pay grade.
How much responsibility lies then with the administration now? When you're saying it was all President Ghani, is there blame to be borne by President Biden and his diplomats who you were working with?
Right. Well, I believe that the diplomat worked very hard. The president made the decision that he did, not to go pursue a condition-based approach, but just a calendar-based approach, because of a belief that if you pursue a condition-based approach, that the Afghan must negotiate and come to an agreement first, that we will be stuck there for a long time, given what he had learned, his negotiators had learned from President Ghani, and from the Talibs, that they were far apart, and an agreement was unlikely on a political formula which the people of Afghanistan desperately needed.
Do you really believe that the Taliban would have, or still will, hold elections or share power? Don't they just want to run the country themselves?
Sure, I mean, and as President Ghani wanted to run the country himself, didn't want to leave office, that's obviously the preferred outcome given their psychologies. But I believe...
And you knew that while you were negotiating with the Taliban, that even though they're agreeing to some form of power sharing, that they, in the end of the day, want to run the country.
I thought that they would agree to a power sharing arrangement because without that, they would have war. We wouldn't leave because that was condition-based. So because, I mean, we all have our own wish list, that's what we would prefer, but what would have been realistic and a condition-based approach, either war or as far as one can see, or a negotiated political settlement. President Ghani, on the other hand, wanted to stay as president for the entirety of his term. And if we had told him, we're not going to give you military support unless you compromise that someone that's mutually acceptable would lead the government.
Why didn't that happen?
Well, because we were didn't want to coerce the president.
Why couldn't Secretary Blinken have done that?
Well, Secretary Blinken did send a letter which was leaked, as you saw, to President Ghani soon after
It was a
he
strongly
came to
worded
power.
letter, but
It
that
was
is
strong.
far different from saying, I'm going to cut you off unless you do this.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of considerations. President Ghani was very effective in lobbying in Washington. He had many friends in various parts of the city. He lived here for a very long time. He was part of, he had a research center not far from where we are today. So there was some reluctance to put that kind of pressure on him. And all of that is also kind of part of the mix that produced the outcome that ultimately happened.
I mean, in your resignation letter, you said this did not turn out as you envisaged.
Right. I would have wished, I would have liked to see a negotiated settlement. I feel for Afghanistan. After all, I was born there, and I have spent a lot of my life on behalf of the United States focused on Afghanistan. I helped them with their constitution. I helped them with their first election. I established an American university in Afghanistan. I was very encouraged by the first years, the enthusiasm, the hopefulness that I observed there. But unfortunately, the political elite of the country made terrible mistakes, allowed corruption, misused elections, democracy, and didn't treat their security forces perhaps the way they should have been treated. And we faced the circumstances we did. Believe me, when I was there as ambassador, if you had asked me would the United States forces would be in Afghanistan in 10 years, I would say, of course not. But because of what happened there, it had an effect here. And the effect here was that it's time to move on, given the changes in the world and given that we've had significant success in dealing with the issue of terrorism.
Why wasn't there a plan in place, at least on the counterterrorism front, to deal with the Taliban, to talk to the Taliban?
Well, we did talk to the Taliban. We have a set of agreements with them, some of which have not been released yet, on what they will do on the terrorism front. We hold them accountable to those agreements. And
I'm sorry, because the administration says that those agreements are not in place, which is why they're trying to build those relationships now with the Taliban.
No, there is agreement in place. There is agreement in place with the Taliban on terrorism and counterterrorism. But
to do what?
Well, that they will not host. They will not allow fundraising. They will not allow training. They will not allow recruitment by individuals or groups that would threaten the security of the United States and our allies, including Al-Qaeda. But since we don't trust them, we are, per President Biden's decision, also having over the horizon, since we are no longer in Afghanistan. We were in Afghanistan until a few weeks ago.
Right.
So we were doing it from there. And since we decided to leave, we're going to do that from beyond Afghanistan. And that remains a critical mission.
So when you say there were counterterrorism plans in place, and
agreements
was that contingent on the United States keeping some kind of presence in Afghanistan?
Well, we had agreed to withdraw completely.
I know what we agreed to, but was there a wink and a nod? I know you know.
The issue was this.
We
and
hear
I
from
will
a
tell
lot
you
of the same
exactly
national security officials in this country, not just Afghanistan, who said, we are going to keep some people there.
What it was is, as I'll describe, which is that the Talibs as Talibs, they said repeatedly, could not agree to an indefinite U.S. military presence, because that would undermine the very raison d'etre of the struggle of the 17, 18 years.
To get out foreign military forces.
Occupation, they described it. But once there is this negotiated government that the two sides will agree to, the decision on what happens afterward would be the decision by that government and by the United States. If the president at that time wanted to have a residual force, that had to be negotiated or would be negotiated with that government after a political settlement.
So there was a wink and a nod that the United States would keep some kind of presence in Afghanistan. Is that what you're saying?
Well, what I am saying,
because that sounds like what you're saying.
What I am saying is what I said, which is that the Talibs could not agree.
Right,
To,
but this new
but
government,
if a new government and the United
the
States,
Taliban would not object to it.
And the United States wanted to, and that government agreed with it, that's different.
So we're saying the same thing, but that went out the window when the United States pulled out completely.
Well,
So the Biden administration essentially blew up what you were saying were agreements.
of
or
course, the
a
situation
framework
changed.
for
The
potential
situation changed radically. We decided to withdraw completely, and two, a negotiated agreement by the two sides was not achieved. So the circumstances also changed.
Do you think Americans are safer now?
I think a big burden is removed from the United States. Some 40 billion American soldiers fighting for a war that wasn't going in the right direction. The terrorist threat from Afghanistan is not what it used to be. The American people should be pleased, not with the way the final phase happened. We all are unhappy with that, but the Afghan war is over for the United States. The burden has been reduced, that we achieved the goal of devastating Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan.
The CIA says Al-Qaeda could reconstitute in as little as a year within Afghanistan.
Well, our record of predicting things, unfortunately, we need to be a little humble in this regard. But
so we're not safer. You're hoping
we are much safer than we were before we went to Afghanistan. When Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden was running camps,
right,
and thousands of people were being trained. Al-Qaeda sponsored Afghanistan. That is gone.
But from August of this year on,
well, we need to keep an eye on the situation. Not to do the same thing we did prior to 9/11, as we were seeing Al-Qaeda was developing, training, organizing, and we didn't have a serious strategy on response to it until after 9/11. We shouldn't repeat that mistake again.
Do you think
we should be monitoring, and we should be responding as we see the situation evolve? I also believe that unless there is some extreme circumstance, the Taliban have also learned their lesson in which they paid a high price for that, allowing the Al-Qaeda to use Afghanistan. They say 19 years, 18 years of suffering for one mistake. That's what they used to tell me. Isn't that sufficient?
Pretty big mistake.
Big mistake, big response. They got big punishment. But now they've committed not to allow that, and we need to monitor it and be able to respond if we see the threat growing.
Do you feel you were misled by the Taliban?
Well, I don't allow people to mislead me. I do my homework. The whole of government. This was not Zalmay Khalilzad alone doing this. I had the military, the intelligence, everyone with me.
You're the only one out here defending it, though.
But that's one reason why I left.
I give you credit for coming and talking about it.
One reason I left the government, as I wrote in my letter, is that the debate wasn't really as it should be, based on realities and facts of what happened, what was going on, and what our alternatives were, what we did, from what we did continued, what was abandoned, and why, and where we should go from here.
Do you feel you're a scapegoat?
Well, some are trying to do that, but I think that would not be fair, putting me aside as an individual, because we wouldn't learn the right lessons then if we just put it on an individual. If we don't ask ourselves, why did our military strategy did not succeed? Why did we not achieve the goals over time that we would have liked to achieve with regard to building this new Afghanistan?
I just want to be clear, because when you say you were not alone in this, you were intimately involved, step by step in this, with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo.
Right, and with the new team when they came. And I explained to you what we achieved.
For the majority of 2 years, it was Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and he knew everything you were negotiating, correct?
Indeed.
So when he runs for president in 2024, as many predict, should he be judged on this?
Well, but I have to say the agreement that we negotiated was a condition-based agreement to end the war in Afghanistan and give the Afghan people a chance for peace. That's what the agreement was.
So he should be judged on that.
I mean, if he does run for president, I'm sure this will be one of the issues on which he will be judged, no doubt.
Because he says that you negotiated a solid deal. It was the execution. It was the execution under the Biden administration.
I have described to you what the agreement was,
right?
The 4 elements, and I also described to you how the decision ultimately was made to put condition-based aside and follow a calendar-based
You're
approach.
laying that on the Biden administration.
No, I'm just saying it was already
the
happening earlier. Because
and they argue you boxed them in, and that they were boxed in by the prior president.
You always inherit agreement from the previous group. You either agree to continue with it, or you say, no, I would like to renegotiate it. So those are the choices that happen all the time. We saw in the previous administration putting the Iran agreement aside. That was an option, or adjusting it. But the decision was...
President Biden could have asked to keep troops longer, is what you're saying.
He could have, then there would have been consequences for it, which is that the Taliban might not have accepted that, and therefore no attack on U.S. forces that was in place for so many months, in which not a single American was killed by the Taliban, from the agreement until full withdrawal. The Taliban might have put that aside. So that was, I think, one of the factors that impacted or influenced the decision that he made.
We've been talking about details and politics, but as you made clear, you feel very passionately about the country of your birth, Afghanistan.
Absolutely, and I will do what I can from outside as an individual with my contacts and relationship both here, there, in the world to help Afghanistan. The struggle goes on. Now it's over to the Afghans. The American encounter with Afghanistan benefited the Afghans enormously. I mean, millions of Afghans with cell phones now connected with the world. Our society has been connected with it. The world has been connected with it. And now, without the military, the burden of the military presence, we need to use all other instruments that we have to encourage it to move towards the objectives of an Afghanistan that's at peace with itself and does not pose a threat to the rest of the world.
But when you see pictures of children struggling to eat, when you see the pictures of women being whipped in the streets, how do you feel when you see that? Do you feel any degree of responsibility for this outcome?
Well, I see there's a lot of work still to be done in Afghanistan. This is a society that has a lot of problems. We need to help them come to an agreement on a formula that is broadly accepted by urban and rural Afghans, by secular and religious Afghans. Afghanistan wasn't an ideal place before we made this agreement and we withdrew. There was a war going on. Every day, 200 to 300 people died. People forget that. People think, we had such a good situation, and look what...
60% of the country in 2018 was under the control of the Taliban when you took this job. The Taliban was winning, as you said.
I mean, nobody said that this was a terrible situation. Fewer people die now in Afghanistan than died then. Much fewer people get killed now in Afghanistan that no American gets killed in Afghanistan.
13 American service people died, though.
As a result of a terrorist attack at the airport by Daesh, which the Talibs are enemy
carried out by ISIS.
By ISIS, and they are at war with each other.
But that bomber was released from prison by the Taliban.
Well, not with the intention.
When they came, not with the intention, but that was what happened. So this wasn't an orderly withdrawal. 13 Americans died. I'm not saying it was an ordered withdrawal. This was an ugly final phase, no doubt about it. It could have been a lot worse. It could be a lot. The Talibs did help with the withdrawal. General McKenzie would tell you they did everything we asked them to do during that final phase. I was on the phone with them constantly. Push this
close this road, allow these buses, it could have been a lot worse. Kabul could have been destroyed. Street to street fighting could have occurred. I went to Afghanistan after 30 plus years after the Soviet withdrawal and what happened. Everywhere you looked, there was destruction, like some German city after World War II. It could have been a lot worse. It could have been a lot worse. It can still be a lot worse, or it can get better. But the choice is now mostly theirs, Afghans. Rumi, the great Afghan born in Balkh, said, you can walk with people, you cannot walk for them. Now it's time for the Afghans to take ownership with non-military assistance. Unless we are threatened, then our military should be in play. But we should not abandon Afghanistan, turn our back on it, use our influence as a country with enormous capability and influence to encourage the emergence of an Afghanistan that the Afghans aspire for.
Ambassador, thank you for your time. Thank you for taking questions.
Thank you very much.